is Christopher Bader. I'm a professor of sociology at Chapman University. And for many years, I've been studying, amongst other things, paranormal beliefs.
And why?
Be- you want to get into that now?
Yeah.
Because they interest me for a lot of reasons. One, I think they're inherently fascinating. I've been interested in the paranormal since I was a little kid. I watched In Search of and shows like that. But also, I've become more interested over time because they are clearly growing in terms of the percentage of people who believe in these things. And I think they're playing an important role in our culture, particularly as other things like religion are changing. So it really interests me to study not so much whether paranormal beliefs are real or not, but more the effect that they're having on society and how they're changing.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff. That's like a perspective that no one really talks about. Everyone's just kind of like, what is it? What are we looking at? What did we
Hmm.
see? But no one really dives into why are we all so fascinated by this?
Hmm. Yeah, that's really what interests me
Oh.
because I've never particularly been interested. I've been on a lot of UFO events, a lot of ghost hunts, Bigfoot hunts, those kind of things. I'm just not as interested in whether those things are actually there or not. I mean, I suppose I would be if one of them grabbed me or something, but but
Hasn't happened
so
yet?
so far that hasn't happened. No.
Mm. Okay, so let's talk about those things. How many different alien species are out there?
Wow. Almost impossible to count because anytime I interview someone new, I find out about new ones. Um, so I can give you a list of some of the most commonly reported ones today,
Let's
but it
do
would
that.
not be an exhaustive list for sure. Someone watching this will be complaining about something that was missed. But the most common ones are the grays,
Mhm.
little diminutive 3 to 4 foot tall beings with big heads and black eyes and gray skin. Probably the most common alien image in popular culture. Then there's varieties of those. There's tall ones, there's shorter ones, there's ones that are more robotic, and they have different colors. There's blue beings that look like the grays. So there's just a huge groups of them. And then there's the Nordics, which are more human-like alien beings. They look pretty much like tall, um, white skinned, sometimes very pale white humans, oftentimes with blonde hair. They really like jumpsuits. A lot of times they're wearing jumpsuits. And then some of the other ones that are really common are praying mantis beings. I hear that a lot. The reptilians are really common and those kind of cross over. They're in conspiracy theories, they're in UFO stories, which are sort of, again, they can vary in size, but oftentimes tall creatures that basically look like upright walking lizards. Um,
Mhm.
but
And when you
after
say
that, there's just so many.
when you say you hear about them, you're talking about people who claimed that they encountered these beings?
Correct. Correct. That I oftentimes go for projects I'm working on, interview people who claim to have experienced aliens in one way or the other. And oftentimes these days, when I go on one of those interviews, I'll hear about new aliens that I hadn't heard about before. So there's dozens and dozens of them.
That's so interesting because I remember one of the things when we met that you spoke about was how, people describe their encounters with aliens according to, what's going on culturally at the time. So to hear that there's new ones all the time, isn't that kind of
To
not
me,
in line with? Mhm.
yeah, to me, it's an interesting development because what I used to notice, because I've been studying this stuff for a long time, is that there was a very small number of alien beings. I'm simplifying a little bit because there's one of the things that UFO researchers would do was gauge the potential reality or validity of an encounter by how much the description the person gave matched one of the descriptions, the small number of descriptions they accepted. That I spent a lot of time with the UFO abduction subculture in the 1990s. And that was very big amongst them is that when someone would claim a UFO abduction and undergo hypnotic regression, and come up with an alien being that sounded like the Gray, they would use that as evidence that these disparate people from all around the world are saying the same thing. See, I would oftentimes hear the similarity with aliens used as a piece of evidence, but over time, I and other people have noticed that as these paranormal subcultures, UFOs included, have become less expert based and more everybody's sharing their stories. Everybody's sharing them online. Everybody's sharing them via their various channels. That this sort of conformity has completely eroded. That it doesn't exist much anymore. I mean, you can have your viewers look up the blue avians and the golden triangle head beings, and you'll see some other very interesting aliens. There's a guy named Ray. I can never pronounce his name. Kasulindich. If you look him up, he's got everything from little flying hamsters to all sorts of dozens and dozens of aliens and strange descriptions about how much they like our bread or don't like our bread. Yeah, look it up. It's
Ray what? Ray
Kasulindich.
Ray Kasulindich, and he's encountered all of them, all of the ones
Yes,
that he's described.
yes, and
And
does
is that
fantastic drawings of them.
and that's
Yeah,
here
and
on Earth, or is he going somewhere, beaming
both,
somewhere?
both, both.
Interesting.
Yeah, yeah. And Russell Kellett is another person. Now, I did not have not interviewed Ray. I'm just fascinated with his drawings and
Hmm.
hope I can get him to do drawings for me someday. But Russell Kellett is someone that I interviewed in England who claims he was a super soldier, that the aliens would take him on time traveling adventures off to fight on other alien worlds. And he claimed to see 8 foot tall 10 foot tall beings that horse heads, beings that look like vampires, all kinds of different aliens. And I call this sort of the democratization of the paranormal, that if you look back at old shows and old paranormal research from the 70s and 80s, it was something that was done by so-called experts. Sort of celebrities would go out and do these things, and they carried a certain weight and a certain authority. You could say, this is what these things look like, this is what they're here doing. But that has very much eroded. That the part of the reason I think it is that if I was to say to you, I saw an alien and it looked like an octopus, if you were to say it back to me, well, that's crap, then I can also call your experience into question. So
Didn't
people are, sorry,
sorry.
go ahead. No,
No,
please go
didn't
ahead.
didn't John Mack also kind of do that? When he was interviewing people, he found that a lot of people that had zero connection with each other were describing the same type of being.
He did.
What's
I
the smile?
the smile is that I think that John Mack's conformity in his reports is something that's a little overstated. That that he, if you read his actual reports, he has a pretty broad brush about what he considers to be looking the same. He when he was studying reports, he would sometimes sort of emphasize those reports that seem to be the most similar and avoid others. I've seen in my own experience spending time with abductees, them subtly pressure each other to come up with the same types of aliens. So,
Why do they do that?
well, this again was back in the 90s when one of their biggest forms of claimed evidence was that the stories were supposedly the same. And so I have witnessed myself interviews and discussions amongst abductees where they've sort of very subtly, I don't even think they know they're doing it, pressured each other to have a similar alien. I was there when some abductees were talking, and one claimed that the alien that she saw at the side of her bed was very tall and purple. And slowly, over the course of a meeting that I was at, that alien became a small gray, because the other members of the group were suggesting, well, perhaps this alien only looked tall because you were in bed. So maybe it wasn't very tall, actually. Perhaps it only looks purple because the room was dark. And so I'm not saying that this is some sort of insidious thing. I'm just saying that people naturally when they have a strong belief, can sort of very subtly push other people into that belief if they're not careful.
And this is an issue. I feel like this is an issue with memory as well. And this is why there's never any, no one ever believes anyone because their memories are shot, or I don't know. There's never like something concrete that you can actually hang on to. And that's why people are, I think, afraid to tell their stories, or maybe not anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely people are more willing, at least in my perception. They seem more willing to tell these stories than they used to be. That the stories are more accepted now. People have more ways of sharing them, and there's a lot more ways that someone who is very isolated can still share their beliefs on forums or in web groups, that sort of thing.
Okay, so what to you is the most fascinating story that you've ever heard about an abductee that you actually made you believe, like, you know what, wait a minute, maybe this could be true? Or you don't even think that way anymore?
Well, I don't really think that much about. I mean, it sounds strange, and people don't believe me when I say it, but I don't really think that much about whether this stuff is actually going on. I don't think I can answer that question. I think the closest thing I could say is that another good half of my research is about religion, and I don't try to prove or disprove that God exists. That's just not possible, in my opinion. So that's just not part of what I do. Um, but I have certainly had encounters with people where I was very convinced of their sincerity, and others not so much. And I can tell you about one of them if you want.
Sure.
There's a there's a woman named I can say her first name because you'd never, but as long as I say her, don't say her last name because I'll mess up if I try to make a pseudonym. But it's a
Mhm.
person named Nancy who contacted me when she'd read some things that I'd written about UFO experiences, and said that she has been being abducted by aliens for quite a long time, and wanted to know if I would come talk to her. So I agreed to do it. And I think she struck me as extremely sincere. She didn't have any interest in having any sort of attention whatsoever. In fact, she wanted to be very clear that I wouldn't ever share her last name or where she lived or anything like that. And also, she was hoping, which I found very rare, that she was hoping that I somehow that I could make the aliens go away. That a lot of people misunderstand about me. I get contacted by people who want me to make the ghosts leave their house or something like that, and that's just not what I do. I'll come over and watch the other people who are trying to get rid of the ghost in your house, but I can't do
Mhm.
anything. And so we had long conversations, and I told her, and I always am honest with people, I don't know what's going on with you, but I can't make the aliens go away. I don't even know if they're really coming. I just don't know. And she showed me drawings of the aliens that were coming to get her, which looked strikingly similar and were very sinister and creepy looking, of gray aliens. And her husband actually told me, this is one thing that struck me, that he would sometimes just wake up out in the yard. That he had never had any experiences himself, but Nancy would claim to that she would wake up in the middle of the night and these gray alien beings were coming to get her, and they would move her husband out of the room and put him in the yard and then come get her and take her away. And her husband didn't claim any of that because he didn't see it. I mean, he believed his wife, but he remembered waking up in the yard several times. And the husband would see balls of light going around the property. He would never see the aliens, but occasionally they would be driving up to the property and see little globes of light. So that always just struck me. I thought it was fascinating. I didn't think that she had no reason to be lying unless she was just enjoying the attention she had from me being there, which is, I suppose, possible. But she seemed like a very sincere person. And her and I actually had frank conversations. She said, "What do you think? Do you think I've seen these aliens?" And I actually said to her, "No, I don't." I said that, and this is, I know, something you wanted to talk about. I said, "This alien you're seeing, I said, I don't really know what's happening to you. All I can tell you is I believe that this alien you're seeing is a cultural construction,
Mhm.
that this gray alien you're seeing is something that has appeared recently in popular culture. It's not as present in other parts of the world. I believe if you'd had a UFO experience in another part of the world, you probably would have seen a different alien. And so we actually got to be friends because she appreciated that I was frank with her. And she just always said, well, maybe one day they'll come get you and you'll know. And so far hasn't happened. So
What did they say? What did she say they were doing with her?
they were sometimes in her room, sometimes floating her up through her ceiling, would just perform various experiments on her that she didn't know the reasoning for. Poking her, skin scraping, putting needles in her. She never claimed, like some abductees did during the 1990s, that she was pregnant and then lost the
Mhm.
baby or something. That was the claim that some people were making. And unlike abductees and contactees today, who oftentimes will have extended discussions with the aliens, she saw them as they were completely mysterious to her. They wouldn't talk to her, they wouldn't communicate to her. They would just come in and get her and do their thing and put her back. So,
It's so interesting, and maybe it is a cultural thing. A lot of people talk about these experiments that they do on them.
mhm, yeah, yep.
Where does
That's
that come from?
well, it again, it's sometimes these things are tough to discuss because all I can say is where the awareness comes from,
Hmm.
um, how we know about it. Somebody who really believes that, and I've talked to and a lot of UFO folks over the time, UFO believers, UFO researchers who just believe that the awareness is just when we find out, but it's been going on for a long time, right? But really, this idea of these little gray guys coming down and experimenting on people goes back to the early 1960s, to the Betty and Barney Hill story. They are the prototype. Um, there were stories before them that had some of these similarities, aliens bringing people up on their spaceships and things like that. But it's really Betty and Barney Hill who, if your viewers don't know, they were a couple
Please
in New
share.
Hampshire. Yeah, and then 1961, they claimed they were on a drive back from a vacation, and they said that they noticed a object in the sky following their car, and they claimed that the object started to come down out of the sky, and then all of a sudden they were back at their home in their driveway and looked at their watches, and several hours had passed, and it was later on when Betty in particular began having nightmares that they ultimately went to a therapist named Dr. Benjamin Simon, who did hypnotic regression. And under that regressive hypnosis, a story came out where actually they claim that where their memory cuts out, the flying saucer landed and small creatures got out of the ship and dragged them from their car on board the ship and conducted experiments upon them. Barney had false teeth. The aliens pulled them out and then tried to tug on Betty's teeth. As it's like, well, why don't her teeth come out? Um, they scraped them. They inserted a needle in Betty, um, and then eventually let them go and supposedly erased their memory. And that story is where all of this comes from, this idea of that aliens can come and abduct you and do experiments on you and erase your memory. They are essentially the genesis of the UFO abduction movement. From a cultural standpoint, that's where all this started. From a believer standpoint, it would be, well, that's the first one that we learned about. The only difference, really, I mean, and I should have said clearly that those were grays. If you look at the drawings that Betty did in particular, they look very much like the grays of today, except they had pupils in one of the drawings that I've seen. And they also, this is the strangest detail, they had black kind of baseball caps on, and they got rid of those after. So far as I know, that didn't reappear. I don't know. They kind of, after that, they said the caps aren't working. Let's get rid of the caps, continue the rest, no more caps. And that didn't show up again. But that was hugely influential. The story was serialized in magazines. It was all over the news at the time. A television movie was made starring James Earl Jones as Barney. And it was just a phenomenon. It was one of those stories that just takes off in the paranormal, like the Amityville Horror or something like that. And so that's really when all this stuff, the abduction stuff, took off.
So once this information is out there, what happens to society?
What happened? Well, I mean, you start to see a proliferation of the same claims usually when a story gets like this, and usually the same type of things when we have some sort of controversial claim like this, they start to sort of mushroom and then explode. And that's, if you look at the abduction claims throughout the 1970s, basically in the wake of the Betty and Barney Hill story and the television movie, there were just a handful of other people that were making similar claims, like Travis Walton and Betty Andreasson. And once the 1980s came around, the movement just exploded. Suddenly, you had people just all over the world, particularly the United States, making these claims.
So let's talk a little bit about the time before Betty and Barney Hill. How were they influenced? Let's say it wasn't true. Like what could have been what could they have been influenced by? You mentioned that there were sightings in the 1800s and the early 1900s as well. And there was some guy that wrote a book that Billy Meyer ripped off. What was his name again?
Yeah, well, there's you might be talking about George Adamski, but
Yes.
that there have been different. The idea of what aliens are have just changed over time. That in there were stories of airships in the 19th century, and the prevailing opinion of what these were, because they were often looked like blimps or mechanical blimps, that type of thing. The prevailing opinion in news stories of the time was that these were created by rogue inventors around the world. It wasn't typically, at the time at least, oftentimes seen as an alien phenomenon. That it really wasn't until the 1940s that you started to see strange objects in the sky much more commonly interpreted as probably extraterrestrials. And it was in the 1950s that you started to have these contactee stories come up, which were just very different from Betty and Barney Hills.
Okay. And I remember you also mentioned that it even goes back to biblical times.
Well, it again, what that you have people. I mean, Ancient Aliens has this type of stuff on all the time that claim that there are stories in the Bible of strange objects in the sky. Ezekiel reported wheels within wheels, and so from a biblical perspective, someone who is interpreting that from a biblical perspective would say, well, these are angelic chariots, these are signs from God, that sort of thing. What some modern UFO enthusiasts do, and certainly people who are into ancient astronauts do, is say, no, that was a misinterpretation. That was people in biblical times seeing something in the sky, and because they didn't know what aliens were, interpreting it as something that God was doing or something angelic.
So basically, based on your belief system, you can go back and pull evidence from other places to decide what it actually means.
Absolutely. That basically what this is it's reinterpretation. And it's going back, and it's not just the Bible that has stories like this. If you look at if you look at multiple religious traditions, you will see stories of strange objects in the sky. And for someone who has a more conventional interpretation, you would say, well, this is just someone's interpretation of a comet. They saw a comet and took it as some sort of divine sign or signal. And if you're taking a modern interpretation, you're really fascinated by aliens, you say, no, those people back then didn't know and they got it wrong.
Interesting. So, and okay, so what year did Adamski write what he wrote and what did he describe?
Sure. So George Adamski, he operated in California, and in the early 1950s, he started making the claim that he was being contacted by friendly human-like aliens. In his first book, Flying Saucers Have Landed, he reported his encounter with a Venusian alien. He claimed that the alien came from Venus. He said that at first, he was looking at strange objects in the sky through a telescope in his backyard. And eventually he got the signal somehow through some sort of mental telepathy that he should go out to the desert, a place called near Desert Center, California, out here in California. And for some unspecified purpose that the aliens might show up. So he and a few friends went out to Desert Center, and they claim that during that they were having a picnic out there essentially, and during that time they saw a large object fly overhead. And Adamski told the rest of the group that you stay here. I'm going to go get closer and see what happens. And he claims that as he got closer, a smaller saucer-shaped craft came out of the larger craft and landed, and a human-like alien. So he described it as, between 5 and 6 feet tall, not super tall, but not short. That it had long blonde hair and was wearing a chocolate brown jumpsuit and looked very human-like. And the alien couldn't speak English, but through a combination of hand signs and a little mental telepathy, told George that he was part of a friendly procession from Venus that was visiting Earth because they were concerned about nuclear testing and worried that that humans might cause some sort of great disaster. And that was the end of it. He just kind of said that, and they said, "I got to go," and got back in his ship and took off. And that was what Adamski reported, and along with a lot of photographs in Flying Saucers Have Landed, which was at the time a pretty big hit for him.
Okay, I totally forgot about the nuclear stuff. Can you please talk about what was going on during that time and maybe compare it with some other sightings or some not sightings, some other encounters? I feel like there's some social issue going on or political issue going on Earth, and then all of a sudden an alien comes and says, "We need to protect you from yourselves." Am I
Yeah,
right?
that's one that's one possible
Like that's
interpretation
not
for
the
sure.
first time. That's not the first
Yeah,
time that I've heard, it's a new, they're trying to save us from blowing ourselves up, everything
right.
that we do affects the world and it becomes almost politicized.
Yeah, and it's not uncommon today, and not just today, but over the last several decades, that people will claim that aliens have told them that the Earth is about to be destroyed by some sort of ecological disaster, and
Mm.
that's actually a fairly common thing amongst abductees and some contactees to be shown images of a great disaster happening on Earth. So that's not unusual. So that's one possible thing that's going on. Is again, it's all about what's your interpretation. If you are someone who believes that George really met this alien from Venus, then you could say, well, aliens come when something bad is happening. If you're someone who has a more cultural interpretation, you could say, well, we need these stories when something bad is happening, and that's why we invent them. And
It's interesting that during the Cold War, it was about nukes, and now it's about global warming,
mhm, yeah, yeah, that definitely
the
the
message.
aliens will change their messages over time, for sure, for sure.
But is that because we have different problems? Like what happened to the nuclear war? That's still an issue. Are they not talking about that anymore, the aliens?
Well, I mean, more often, what I hear, I shouldn't say I hear. It's not like I've got a huge group of abductees regularly reporting to me or something, but I more often hear today that when people are reporting some sort of message from the aliens, that it's about something like ecological disaster. But that's not to say that war and nuclear annihilation is not still on on
Mhm.
the aliens' minds. They may be bringing that up as well.
I
Somebody
really
needs
I
to go and
shouldn't
document. Yeah.
Yeah, I shouldn't be laughing. It's just I remember when we were doing Alien Files, like I went down such a rabbit hole and I did so much research and I just felt like the more I believed that, what, maybe this is true, I would get another piece of information. I'd be like, "Oh my God, wait, this is all total bullshit." It's just so I was so conflicted the entire time. Like I really believed Peter Faust, for example. Like I
Hmm.
really believed him. I mean, when I was listening to John Mack's hypnoregression therapy, like when I was listening to the tapes, I was just like, oh my God, how is this even made? How is this made up? Like, why would he even make this up? You know? But I don't know. It's just so conflicting. It's very, this is why I feel guilty laughing. Like Billy Meyer had me. Billy Meyer had
Hmm.
me for sure. I was convinced and I was like, okay, because of my religious background and all the Bible studies that I did, I think that everything that he was able to interpret and like all the questions that I had about the Jewish Bible, he kind
Hmm.
of had an answer for. And I was like, oh my God, that works. I was just so gullible. And then all of a sudden, I would get a piece of evidence like these images were fake or,
Right. The fake dinosaurs and the, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Or, like the weird gun that the aliens left him,
Hmm.
I don't know.
Well, I
Or
think,
just there's like a field, like an open field, right by where he had this alien encounter. There's a completely open field and there's one tree and there's a picture of the alien ship crashing into the one tree. You came a very far, far distance with amazing technology to crash
right.
into like the one tree in the open field. I don't know,
I think
just
I know the picture you're talking about. Yeah, where it's
yeah,
just it appears to be stuck to the
yeah,
tree. That
yeah,
one image. Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
well, I think that I mean, I've known a lot of people over the years who've had experiences that I've met people who I thought were BSing me, who I just thought were making up a story. But I mean, I can't know for sure. I mean, we all have our own BS meters, right? And just I've spent a lot of time with a lot of people, and sometimes I just meet someone and I think, I don't think you even believe this happened to you.
Mhm.
But I've met many other people in every paranormal realm, whether we're talking ghosts, Bigfoot, UFOs, whatever, that I do believe were sincere. But sincere doesn't necessarily mean it really happened to them. But
Mhm.
I can't really judge that. The thing that I have learned not to do though is to decide that the phenomena itself is real because someone is sincere about it. Because to me, if you go down the sincerity route, then you have to believe in everything. If because I just as many UFO folks I know that are very sincere about their UFO abduction stories. I know an equal number of people who are very sincere about their Bigfoot encounters, an equal number of people who think there's a demon living in their house and are very sincere about it. So we can't pick and choose. We can't say, well, this person who's sincere about demons is telling a lie, and this person who's sincere about Bigfoot, but I like UFOs more. So if someone tells a very compelling story, I'll believe that. So I tend to I don't know what's really going on in these cases. I don't pretend to. I'm not someone who goes and says, here is what you actually saw or what you actually experienced. But I I've spent a lot of time with a lot of people. I've spent time who've recovered memories that gigantic satanic cults are operating the world, and spent time with people who really sincerely believe in reptilian conspiracies. Russ Kellett is absolutely sincere and compelling when he talks about his time as a time traveling super soldier. So, who am I to come in and say, just because of my own personal thing, you're sincere, Russ, but I think you're full of shit just because I don't like your story.
Right.
Um, so that's where I don't find it particularly convincing anymore, just from a personal sense when someone's just sincere. I don't know what's really happened, but what we clearly know from psychology and sociology is people can be awfully sincere about things that didn't really happen.
Which brings me to Charles Hall.
Okay.
Um, okay, can you give us like a 2-minute background on Charles Hall and what he saw in Ellis Air Force Base and why he was there and what his claims were?
Sure. I mean, he was in the Air Force. He was stationed at Nellis Air Force Base, which is outside of Las Vegas in the 1960s.
Mhm.
And at the time that he was there, he didn't say anything. Um, but later on, it was in the, what was it, the 2000s? I don't, off the
Mhm.
top of my head, I'm trying to remember when that
I
memoir
think
came
it's
out. It
I
was
think it's early 2000s, Millennial Hospitality.
Millennial Hospitality. Yeah. But Hall claims, so I always think it's important because there are a lot of these types of tales that we have no record of Hall reporting to his superiors at Nellis Air Force Base, "Hey, who are these weird dudes hanging out in the mess
Hmm.
hall?" Um, that it was later on when he released Millennial Hospitality that he claimed that, in fact, the whole time he was working at Nellis Air Force Base, he was working alongside these aliens that he ultimately called the Tall Whites, which were, look to me when I see images of them, almost like if you took George Adamski's aliens and the aliens of the abductees and put them in a blender, because they had very whitish gray skin, but they were taller than the little gray guys were supposed to be. They had a lot of the drawings, they have this sort of wispy hair and these very big eyes. So they were, and that description of tall whites has become also popular since Hall's story. But he's someone, and we've had others like him. We've had some with regard to the Roswell story who write these later memoirs where they say, actually, during this previous time in my life, this is what was happening.
Okay, so Charles Hall's tall whites, don't they also look like like Billy Meyer's Nordics?
They do. I mean, it depends. Again, some of these images vary, but when you see these tall whites, they I would say that Billy Meyer's Nordics look a lot closer to what George Adamski claimed to see, whereas these tall whites look much paler and more ghostly than the aliens that you see in the like Semyasi, and those
Hmm.
aliens look much more. In fact, one of the fake images he had was some blonde women on a talk show, right?
Right.
Yes, that
But
they looked.
he claims Billy Meyer claims that the CIA or whoever went in and tampered with the original images and they messed with it so that everyone can say like, oh, that's actually from a talk show. They were the
Mhm.
dancing. I don't even remember which singers they were, but they were famous singers. But yeah, he claims that it wasn't fake, that it was, the government was messing with
Sure.
him, you know,
Yeah. Big
to
surprise. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, no, Billy Myers aliens, I think, could walk up to you in a cafe and you would, if they weren't wearing, you know, carrying around, have a pet dinosaur and they weren't wearing a jumpsuit or something, you wouldn't necessarily know they weren't humans.
Yeah.
Whereas
Well,
these tall whites,
Yeah,
the tall
Charles
one.
Hall he said that he lived with them for 2 years and
Hmm.
that they would jump really high, they were super fast, they were extremely strong. They would communicate with him telepathically and they could read his mind and his thoughts and they trusted him. But you were talking about the times that he wrote it later on
Yeah, he
and
wrote it
yeah.
later on, and I'm not an expert on a story. I'm familiar with this story. Just I sort of have to be familiar with all of these stories, but I'm not aware of any evidence that he's presented that indicates that there's any record of this before he wrote this book. That I mean, it would be impressive if somehow, again, these are problematic. We know these things happen with Hitler's diaries and other things like
Mhm.
that. That if somehow back in 1967 we found his diary and he's saying, "Boy, these people can jump really high," and they're
Yeah.
why I'm hanging out with all these aliens. But it's from a skeptic's perspective, it's pretty suspicious that this stuff doesn't come out much later.
Yeah, and you mentioned that it was kind of like an amalgamation of a lot of things that happened. Time had passed, so he had a lot of
Mhm.
material to choose from while he was writing. But what I'm trying to get at is there a profile of a person that has an alien encounter?
Not as much anymore. There used to be in the early days. I did surveys of abductees in the early days in the 1990s and early 2000s of abductees, and they they tended to be upper middle class white females were the most likely to claim abduction experiences. But
Interesting.
nowadays it seems to have broadened quite a bit. This is the same profile of people who also claim to recover memories that they've been abused by Satanists. That an upper middle class white female is also the profile at the time of a person who would be likely to go to therapy.
Mhm.
So, and for some people, that's where these tales came out, were in therapy. But the therapeutic community has broadened. That if you look back to the 1990s, the average survey, a male would say in response to a survey, "No, I don't. I've solved my own problems. I don't go to therapy." They would
Mhm.
see therapy as weak or something like that. That is, there's still today, men are less likely than women to go to therapy, but that base has broadened quite a bit. So there was a profile then that doesn't exist as much now.
Would you do another survey today?
I would if I had the group to do it. That back in the 1990s, there were a lot of these UFO abduction support groups, these sort of pre-existing networks. Bud Hopkins had a network of groups. There were several that were based out of California. There was one based out of Washington called the UFO CCI. That these broad alien abduction support groups don't seem to exist to such an extent anymore. And that was the network I was able to tap into. That
What? Mhm.
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, what about John Mack and everything that he did, his group? Where does that fall under Bud Hopkins?
That's I consider them sort of the same grouping there, Bud Hopkins and John Mack. That's sort of that same period of time there.
Can you tell our viewers who John Mack was?
Sure. John Mack was I don't know if I can tell them who Bud Hopkins was since I consider them so associated, but
Do that too.
okay. Um, so Bud Hopkins was an artist from New York who became very interested in stories of UFO abductions and began doing hypnotic regression on people in the New York area at first, who claimed to have these experiences with aliens similar to what Betty and Barney Hill did, and became probably the preeminent voice in the UFO abduction community during that time. His book, and it was really him who is responsible for the idea that UFO abduction is much wider than we might think it is. That he made prevalent the idea that you don't have to have necessarily seen a UFO like Betty and Barney Hill did to have had an alien abduction experience. Because recall, with Betty and Barney Hill, they claim that at all times they could remember a strange object in the sky. They just forgot what happened when it landed. But what Bud Hopkins said is that if you're someone who is very petrified of a certain stretch of road and you don't know why, that might mean that you were abducted on that stretch of road. So basically, he widened the potential group of abductees to people who had seen an alien or a UFO, to anyone who might have some sort of phobia or fear that they might not understand the source of. And that automatically increased the ranks of potential abductees. And he also is the person who, in his book, again, he was making these claims based upon his interviews with people who made the claim that the aliens were here for a particular reason, which was basically reproductive experiments. They were trying to create hybrid human gray alien babies. Um, and John Mack was a Harvard psychiatrist who became convinced that these alien abduction stories were real. And that was a big moment when you had someone from Harvard who was claiming that there was something to these stories. And so he began doing interviews with abductees himself. And he differed from Bud Hopkins in the sense that Bud Hopkins certainly had the view that the aliens, if they weren't sinister, they were at least had no considerations for humans and what they wanted. But John Mack's stories had much more of a spiritual bent, that he was willing to suggest that the alien encounters might in some cases be positive. But Mack, I don't remember the year off the top of my head, but Mack died.
Like
Do you
70,
remember the?
72.
No, it was later than that. Later than that. But when Mack
69.
died, I think he would have continued to be a bigger figure in the UFO community if he'd been around longer. But
Well, didn't he randomly die out of nowhere? Wasn't there a whole conspiracy theory around that? And that
there are
three,
conspiracy theories claiming that Mack was killed because he was getting too close to the truth, but those are common in the UFO community whenever
I mean,
anyone.
didn't didn't like two or three other John Macks die that same day? Or so
I
they
don't.
say.
Well, that's awesome. That's the first. Well, not awesome. That was the mean things.
We
That is
understand
the
what you,
that
yeah.
is the first I've heard of this. So I'm afraid I don't know that conspiracy theory, but I'm going to look it up after this. So I did not know about the multiple John Macks dying the same day. They were trying. Supposedly the story is they were trying to get the right one, and they
I don't
just
know,
kill
but
every John
just
Mack in
kill
the
all of
area to
them.
make sure we.
You
Yeah.
know, I don't know, but it's funny because you say he was getting too close to something, and I wonder if because there's a theory about Charles Hall that I don't even know if it's a theory. I think it's actually legit that they did some testing on him while he was serving in Vietnam, perhaps that messed with his brain.
Mm. Yeah. I don't. I'm not sure about
Some
that.
psyops, something,
Is
and
that
that.
something he's claiming or something that's come out afterwards?
You know what? I don't remember. I'll have to ask Lori. I think Lori McDonald was the one that mentioned it to me.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, they apparently, and like the claim is that, they messed with his psyche and with his brain and like as you mentioned earlier, and that's how we got into Charles Hall to begin with, is that people actually, they're probably not lying. They're like genuinely believe that things happen to them. You said they're sincere. It doesn't mean it's true, but they're sincere about believing that it happened to them. And Charles Hall was one of those people because they messed with his brain so much that he genuinely believed all this stuff happened to him. But what he could have been talking about was the experiments that the military was doing on him.
Yeah, I mean it's hard to say. I mean, I don't know Hall personally. I've never interviewed him myself, so I can't give him my own BS test.
Hmm.
But I mean, it's quite possible again that I don't want to suggest, particularly when we're both having fun talking about Billy Meyer's fake dinosaurs and things like that. That I have met a lot of people who are genuinely sincere. So I wouldn't say that they haven't had some sort of experience. I just can't say what it is. I can't,
Do
and
you
I
believe?
cannot say that it's not entirely a psychological experience, but maybe, I can't say that either.
But let's go down the fun, like conspiracy theory rabbit hole a little bit.
Okay.
When we say that John Mack, there's a conspiracy theory out there that John Mack was potentially killed because he got too close to what? What are these experiments? Like Betty and Barney Hill, why did they choose to be experimented on? Was it perhaps military experimentation going on that they're trying to cover up with talking about aliens out there on purpose to make people sound crazy?
I suppose that's one possible interpretation. I mean, I think that, and there's lots of interpretations of their experience. I've even heard ones that are focused upon the fact that they were a mixed race couple. That Barney was African American, Betty was white. This was in the turbulent 1960s. They would have trouble with their neighbors. That there was a lot of pressure on their relationship. And I've seen cultural interpretations that suggest that if you think about it, you have a story of these strangers coming down and poking and prodding at you and pulling you apart. And guess what? Those creatures are gray, a mixture between black and white. And I've seen some pretty compelling interpretations that suggest that this is the source of Betty's nightmares in the first place.
Hmm.
So I think there's multitudes of different explanations. I just think that it's difficult to pin down any one. Unfortunately, neither
Yeah.
one of us was there.
Well, that wasn't that also what in order to decide whether or not they were trying to figure out whether or not she could be telling the truth, and they ultimately decided, it's a lie, it's just her psychological issues with being a mixed race couple. Wasn't that like their official observation for their story?
Well, Ben Simon, who was the who conducted the hypnosis, the regression on Betty and Barney, he ultimately thought at first he thought that was the probable explanation for her nightmares in the first place. But he became much more convinced upon hearing their stories that perhaps they actually had an anomalous experience. So when you're saying they, I'm not sure who you mean. There's certainly some skeptics out there who would say that this was well, there's some skeptics out there who just say that the two of them were lying for attention. And there's some skeptics out there that say, no, they were sincere, but this was really just them misinterpreting trauma that they were facing.
Right.
So there's unfortunately for any given UFO story, there's 100 different possible explanations, right? And another one would be, and it's one I've heard quite a bit actually, is the claim that there are no aliens, kind of like you're saying, this is some sort of psyop that that people are just made to think that there are aliens because the government's experimenting on us in some way. I've heard that in conspiracy circles quite a bit.
Can you elaborate more on that, what you've heard?
Sure. Just I've had some abductees tell me, some people who've just had more broad alien encounters tell me that they have had some of them claim that they've had alien encounters in concert with the military, that,
Mhm.
in other words, the military is somehow helping the aliens. There's a term called MILABs, military abductions, where the military is in concert with aliens, helping them engage in the abductions for some unknown purpose shared between the government and the aliens.
Well, Charles Hall had an answer for that. They wanted to colonize other planets, right? That's what
Yeah.
he was saying. That's what his claim was, is that, and didn't he also say that he worked um on repairing, or like Earth is potentially, like a pit stop, a garage where um we can, repair their ships and in exchange for access to these planets so that we can colonize them later on.
There's been quite a few claims amongst people who claim alien experiences that Earth is somehow special, and that some of the treaties that have been made with aliens are for either technology or for access to other planets. And that's sort of where this whole super soldier idea came out of, for sure.
Okay,
But
sorry, you
in terms of
keep going.
no, I was just going to say that that I have that I've heard two versions, and I've heard the version where, and this is a version that has existed for a while in stories such as in Dulce, New Mexico, claims that the government is sharing bases or giving aliens part of a base, and similar stories about Area 51. But you started to have some abductees starting to claim that they actually would remember during their regressions or during their memories of the abduction that there were actually military personnel on the spaceship, sometimes directing the abductee at gunpoint to get on the spaceship, that sort of thing. So that's one version, and the other version that I've heard from some people in the UFO realm is that perhaps that this is all a government operation, that the government, for some unknown purpose, usually the purpose I've heard is some form of control, that by using the images of aliens, they can control us. I don't know if I'm sure you've heard the term false flag before.
Hmm.
The idea that the government or a government would create some sort of disaster that was created by themselves, by the government, as a means of control. And it's been a common theme in the UFO realm, from I've seen it in Bill Cooper and on up and different folks, that the government might use a false alien invasion to gain control of the populace. And so that's the other version of this tale, where the military is involved in UFO tales, claims that maybe none of them are real, that this is just the government using some sort of mind control weapon to
Hmm.
make us have hallucinations or experiences or memories of having a UFO encounter.
Another something is this big disinformation campaign, just to prevent our adversaries from knowing the type of technology that we have. Like, maybe we're reverse engineering technology that we received from aliens, or that's completely made up, and we don't have any weapons. What are you talking about? It's just an alien invasion. It's not, it's a
Right,
sighting. It's not us. It could go
right,
either
right.
or. So interesting. But nowadays it just seems like sorry, before I get into that, I was going to say that over the course of the research that I did for the show when we were filming, it just seemed like all these sightings and all these encounters, at least the ones that I've researched, usually happened around military bases.
Mhm.
Is that
Which kind of
true?
account? Not really, no. I mean, it depends on what type of encounters you're talking about.
Well, sightings Encounters are different, but actual sightings usually happen around military bases. Sightings of UFOs.
Certainly ones that get a lot of attention happen around military bases,
But
but no,
are
UFO
no?
sightings happen everywhere, and UFO encounters happen everywhere. So
Okay.
certainly there's reasons to think why a government base might have a preponderance or more sightings in other places because there's going to be strange objects in the sky
Right.
that people can't identify. But I've never seen anything to suggest. Could be wrong, but I just know that from my own experience, it just happened everywhere.
Mhm. Okay. So going back to societal norms and culture, what would you say like the top three influences were besides Benny and Barney Hill?
In terms of these alien
Mhm.
stories,
Mhm.
yeah, I would say that in terms of the top influences, I mean, I don't want to be annoying and say, well, it depends on when you're talking, but it does kind of depend on that because
Tell us.
certainly early in UFO history, it'd be the sighting of Kenneth Arnold back in 47 when he claimed that he saw objects flying around Mount Rainier in Washington State. That was huge because when he saw these objects, he was a fire equipment salesman and also a private pilot. So he would fly around to do sales and fly between different small airports in the Northwest. When he was flying to Idaho, I believe, and at that point he saw 9 strange objects flying between the mountain peaks of the Cascades, and claimed that those objects were delta shaped. They weren't flying saucers like are sometimes depicted in pictures of it, but he claimed that he could clock them by looking between the mountain peaks, and they were flying far faster than any known aircraft could at the time. And so when he landed, he reported this while he was up in the air. When he landed, he actually started giving reports to the press, and that story was huge. And he actually described the objects as flying as a saucer would if you skip them across water, and that's where we get that term "flying saucers" from.
Mhm.
And that was hugely influential because that was a very well publicized, very very big story that was sort of cementing this idea. Not that there hadn't been sightings before, but there was a huge proliferation of UFO sightings afterwards because he cemented this idea of these objects in the sky may be extraterrestrials.
And that
And
was in 47.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
so that's also interesting because or maybe this didn't come out until after he mentioned it, but during World War II, weren't pilots talking
yes.
about okay, so take us
Yes,
into
the,
that.
the pilots were talking about Foo Fighters during
Hmm.
World War II and describing them as oftentimes small globe-like objects that would be flying around their planes. And at the time, the predominant explanation for nowadays, if when people talk about Foo Fighters, they talk about those as aliens. But at the time, they were oftentimes perceived to be secret weapons, some sort of unknown weapon that the Japanese or the Germans were using. There weren't pilots back in that time reporting Foo Fighters and say, I think there's aliens chasing us around. They were concerned that these were, in fact, some sort of secret weapon.
I
But
mean,
again, with reinterpretation,
mhm.
going back and looking at those stories, almost immediately, once we'd changed our interpretation to say that strange objects in the sky are probably extraterrestrials, people immediately started looking back at those stories of the Foo Fighters, looking back at the stories of airships back in the 19th century, and saying, in fact, that was people who didn't understand what they were looking at, seeing aliens.
Okay, so then where does Hitler come in and his entire program for building alien ships, or is that bullshit or did that actually
That's
happen?
if that's not bullshit, someone will have to prove it to me. Yeah, that's
Really?
bad documentary stuff. The now having there's certainly at times there was the Avro car, the different developers, different builders have tried to create planes or aircraft that were in the shape of a saucer or saucer like to try to see if that would work. But I have never seen anything outside of very bad documentaries and conspiracy stories suggesting that Hitler had flying saucers running around.
You don't understand. I went so far down this rabbit hole that I took the Hitler story and the Billy Meyer story and I connected them. I was like, okay, so Billy Meyer is basically saying that, aliens created us, okay? And
Mhm.
Adam and Eve were actually aliens, et cetera, et cetera. He even has like the apple from the ship that Ptah, that's a Hebrew word, gave him. Um,
Mhm.
and I was like, holy shit, Hitler's trying to find the original Jewish seed. I'm like, he's going after us. And that's why he started, building ships or whatever, spacecraft. It's just so crazy. My head went so far down that.
No, I mean, I rarely, I'm careful because again, I mean, my interest is in how these beliefs are changing and the effect they have on society. And it's not my place. And I don't even I don't research these things with that goal in mind. But
Mhm.
I will say, just for shits and giggles, no, if there's something at the bottom of my list of things that I think are probably actually happening, it's Hitler having a fleet of flying saucers. And
Okay. Okay, so Kenneth
now I can get
Arnold
some
said.
angry emails. I can get some angry emails about that now.
Okay, back to Kenneth Arnold. That was the first one you mentioned. The
I
big
would say,
cultural
Yeah,
influence.
Kenneth Arnold. If Roswell was something that its biggest effect was not contemporary. The news story that the Air Forces captured a flying saucer did come out at the time, was quickly reversed to
Hmm.
say that it was in fact a weather balloon, and that was the end of that story contemporaneously at that time. It wasn't until the 1980s when the Roswell incident came out that that was sort of rediscovered, and Berlitz and Moore said at that point, well, in fact, this was a government cover up, that follow up story saying it was a weather balloon. And we have these witnesses who claim that they've seen things. So if it had been the same phenomenon at the time, it certainly would have been. But Roswell was not one of the big ones back then. It um, would have been Kenneth Arnold, would have been a very big one. The sighting of UFOs over DC in '52 was very big. That caused quite a sensation. I would say that Betty and Barney Hill equally in the early 1960s. That I would say that those to me are sort of the three big events from the early time. And again, pick another person who is interested in UFOs, and I think anyone would pick Arnold, but they might disagree about the others. But
What about the
definitely those are
Battle of Los Angeles?
that's a big one too. Yeah, the Battle of Los Angeles is a big one.
What
That
happened? What happened there? Like, what do you think happened?
Oh, I have no idea what happened there. I mean, my friends who are into UFOs and believe in them believe that that was basically flying saucers coming over Los Angeles and the military reacting to them. Other skeptics claim everything from this was the an overreaction to balloons, to anything else you can imagine. So yeah, I wish I was there, but I can't tell you
And
what.
what year was that? Battle of LA.
Boy, I tell you, you've got me too many years
I
off
know,
the.
I'm sorry. I think it was in the 40s
I'd have to
or
look it up, but
50s.
but
40s
yeah, I
or
have to keep.
50s. We were talking about some cultural shifts and, is society more open now to absorbing this information than they were back in the day? Like why you say Roswell was shot down right away. Like the first story was, oh, flying saucers, and then they shot it down and everyone believed them. Everyone believed the government when they said, no, 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 that didn't happen. Tell us what you think about cultural
Well, now
changes.
I mean, well, the big one is just distrust of government has just skyrocketed since the 1960s. So certainly, well, and I think the acceptance of the government just saying no, it was a weather balloon at the time was both higher trust in government and less belief in aliens at the time. And belief in aliens has grown quite a bit since the 1940s. All the data that we have suggests that the belief in UFOs has increased quite a bit over time. We used to be, or some of the earliest data I saw that said something like 8-9% of Americans believe that some UFOs might be from another planet. Now we're closer to 30% of Americans, so it's quite a growth. And so when you combine increasing belief with distrust of the government, nowadays, if something similar happened, if we had a news story come out saying, well, an alien just walked into Walmart and was caught on video, and then the next day the government came out and say, no, that didn't happen, that was a guy in the costume or something, then today there'd be a much different reaction than if that happened in the 1940s. More people would believe it for certain and believe that there was a cover up. That we just to give you a sense, if you want to hear it, that as far as conspiracy theories go, we're very much more prevalent to believe in conspiracies of all kinds than ever before. That 2 years ago, colleagues and I asked on a survey of a random national sample of Americans about a whole host of conspiracy theories. We asked about JFK, we asked about alien cover-ups, but we put one in there that nobody had reported. We called it the South Dakota crash. So the question was, the government knows more than it's telling us about, and the JFK assassination, he said, the extent to which you agree or disagree with that. The aliens are visiting Earth, the extent to which you disagree or agree with that. 35% of Americans agreed that the government's covering up the South Dakota crash that we made up. And that just tells you how conspiratorial Americans are, that they hear something and say, yeah, well, okay, sure, yeah. Never heard of this South Dakota crash, but for sure the government's covering it up.
Wow. And
One thing I
why?
don't know is if it'll become a thing. I'm curious to see if in another 5 or 6 years there'll be a website about the South Dakota crash or something. We didn't even say what kind of crash it was. We didn't say if it was an alien crash, just two cars crashing together. We just said South Dakota crash. So if ever interpretations pop up, it'll be interesting.
That is fascinating. I wonder why everyone was more trusting of the government back in the 40s and 50s than today. Is it us or them?
I mean, it's I think it's both, but certainly, the events of Vietnam, Watergate, those I'm this is not unique me saying this, just most cultural historians say this type of thing, that you start to see distrust in the government just increasing very rapidly after those events. That essentially Americans learning, hey, the government can make bad decisions and the government can sometimes lie to us. Not that that wasn't something a lot of people knew before, but it brought a sense of awareness to it. And you've seen distrust in the government growing ever since. That in our last survey, we found that the number one fear of Americans over everything else, they're more afraid of this than serial killers, they're more afraid of this than hurricanes, everything is the fear of corrupt government officials. That 65% of Americans think that that's the biggest problem the country is facing, is corrupt government officials. And that's across the aisle, that Republicans think Democrats are corrupt and Democrats think Republicans are corrupt. And that sort of attitude is where there's just this polarization to the extent where you don't just think, well, Republicans have the wrong ideas, you think they're the wrong people. That you don't think Democrats are just misguided, you think that they're evil. We use words like demoncrats and things like
Mm.
that. That's just not the type of thing that you saw a few decades ago. That there's been a polarization and a distrust which would lead any sort of UFO event to be much more likely to be believed, for sure.
What else has changed? I mean, we spoke about religion briefly. Can we dig
Mhm.
into it a little bit more? Like, do you see any
Sure.
similarities? Do you see any similarities between the UFO world and religion?
Sure. I think there's a lot of similarities between them. Some of them are very direct. There are UFO religions that have popped up over the years. The Aetherius Society. Some would, some would call what Billy Meyer is doing. It's a religion, obviously, with the
Give
Talmud
it,
Emmanuel the
give
religious.
us like a 2 minute brief on Billy Meyer so that we could hear what you're saying in context.
On who he is. We've been talking
Yeah,
about him the whole time. Okay, but
I know,
I
but
guess
I feel
we
like
need
we
to.
owe it, we
We
owe him
owe
an
it.
explanation. Yeah.
Okay. So Billy Meyer is a what you would I'd call him a contactee. He's a Swiss contactee who in the 1970s started telling a local spiritual group that he was hanging out with that he was having encounters with aliens and seeing flying saucers. And his stories were popularized in Switzerland, but didn't really hit the United States until the 1980s when they were first publicized in a series of books over here. And then he showed up on all sorts of documentaries and shows since then. And what's the most dramatic thing about Meyer are, I think, two things. One are just the incredible volume of photographs he claims to have of the various ships. One we've already talked about. There's one of his most famous ones. There's a big tree, and there's just this big disc just looking like from a certain perspective stuck in the tree, right? He said it was flying around the tree, but it looks like, I mean, if you're skeptical, it looks like he pasted a big model up in the
Hmm.
stuck a big model up in the tree. But he had a lot of very dramatic photographs. His books were filled with these photographs of various beam ships and spaceships flying around his property, most of them saucer-like, some with big globules on top of them. I'm sure you've seen some of those.
The
Um,
wedding cake spaceship.
the wedding cake spaceship. And he started to claim that he was actually in communication with those aliens.
Since he was a
They,
boy, a young
what's
boy.
that?
Since he was a young boy,
Since he
since he
was a
was
young
four
boy,
or
yeah.
5 years old.
Right, right. But he started to during the time where he actually again that was something where later on he would
Mhm.
claim that, right? What happened contemporaneously as he became famous was he started to claim that these aliens were visiting his farm. He had some photographs of them, which were dubious at best. He claimed that the aliens took him on trips to other places where he saw dinosaurs, and he had I think those photos of dinosaurs that he took once. Those are from a were those from an old documentary
Children's
or an old
book.
nature book? I'm trying
It
to
was
remember where
like,
those went.
I think it was a children's book, like an
The children's book.
illustrations from a children's book.
He would take a blurry photo of yeah of so he was very controversial because for believers his photographs were so crisp and clear that because they are very interesting to look at that they would say that they could not be faked. But he had a lot of trouble actually demonstrating any of these things for anybody but him, having these spaceships show up when others were around, being able to have Semyase show up in a crowd of people or something, that was something he always had difficulty producing evidence. But the
Well,
other thing,
sorry to
so
cut you off.
no,
What's interesting um is that the people now that are there at the center, you know what? Continue and then I'll tell you what's interesting.
well, I'll just say the other
Yeah.
thing I think that is interesting about Meyer is just that he has developed this sort of quasi religion around himself because he claims that he has this book called the Talmud Emmanuel, which he claims is a holy book provided by the aliens. He has a mysterious story about a about an old priest who somehow discovered the book, who he's never been able to provide access to this person. But it's essentially, I think of it as very similar to the Book of Scientology or Book of Mormon or something. It's sort of a new spin on a lot of old theological ideas, but in his he connects it directly to sort of Old and New Testament ideas, and it's sort of lightly, you might consider it drawing very heavily upon Christian and Judaic themes in the Talmud Emmanuel, and so that was something
And his
that
prophecies.
and prophecies, yeah, and that's something that not every clearly it's fairly rare for UFO people who encounter UFOs to develop a whole religious system, but it has happened many times before. There's quite a few of these groups around.
So he also has a center called the Figu Center in
Mm-hmm,
Switzerland where people work and they, have these
mm-hmm.
sessions and Semyazi comes and speaks to them sometimes, apparently, which is what I was about to say. That's very interesting because the people that I've spoken to from the Figu Center are Many of them have claimed to have contact with these beings as well. So I don't know. Is it, and this is going back to the question, are there similarities between religious groups and the UFO community in terms of belief? How does it work from from a sociological or psychological perspective? When you believe something, um, it are you more inclined to remember things that
And
or see things that, are in line with your belief system?
of
that
course,
that
yeah.
couldn't that didn't happen or did happen, or you feel like it happened, you can make it up, but it really did happen. I don't even know what I'm asking, but I think you get it.
No, I think that we can't what we can't answer is the last part of what you said. They made it up. It really happened. It didn't happen. We don't know if it did. All we do know is that when people join a religious group, they most definitely tend to start reinterpreting their lives in terms of what that religious group has told them, what they've been taught. So and they'll also start to reinterpret the things that happen subsequently as part of the religion. That just to give you the most basic example, that I've spent a lot of time with religious folks all across the spectrum, and things that someone who's not religious might call luck, they consider fate.
Mhm.
Something that and I'm just talking very broadly here. Obviously, religious groups differ in these things, but once you if you join an evangelical religious group, for example, evangelical Christian group who they tend to have very strong beliefs that God is actively working in the world through his believers, that God is not something or someone that is distant and removed, but is very active and hands-on in the world, that they will tend to start to reinterpret world events as somehow a sign of what God wants to do. That bad luck that they are having has to do with them somehow displeasing God or God wanting to teach them a lesson. Good luck that they're having is something where God is blessing them. It is not at all uncommon for people in religious groups to hear voices, to believe they've been healed, to, in some of the evangelical groups, think that they are possessed or have a demon in them. That these are things that happen in a religious group. So it doesn't surprise me at all that people in Billy Meyer's group, if they've become strong believers, would come to believe that they were somehow in communication with Semyasi. Now, if she's walking in the room and just saying hello and having a buffet with them, that's different. And I wish they'd invite you and I to show up. If it's something,
Actually,
if
they
it's,
did, and we did arrive there with our camera crew in Switzerland, and we had it all booked, and we were about to film. And when we arrived, one of the members there said to us, "So actually, by the way, we spent like $16,000 for just to be there for one day." And this person says to us, "Well, Semyazi came and spoke to us last night, and she told us not to do the documentary."
okay. And when they say
And
came and talked to her last night, what do they mean? Do they mean channeling, or do they mean walked in the room and say,
I,
no, don't do it?
I honestly don't know because that's where the conversation ended.
Okay.
Um, and obviously by the end of it, we spoke to someone else and we got it all figured out, but we spent like a good 10 hours there not doing anything. And then finally, once we got the go ahead to film, we had to, rebook everyone's flights.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really intense.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm guessing, but again, your your listeners will correct if I'm wrong, that it's was pretty common in these UFO religious groups for the founder of the group to claim direct experiences with the aliens, and then other members of the group to only experience those aliens through channeling sessions. George King, for example, founder of the Aetherius Society, he claimed to have been up on spaceships, to have met the Master Jesus on a mountain, to have had numerous direct face-to-face encounters with aliens. But as far as if you were a member of his group, what you would get is you would get George channeling those aliens. So I'm wondering if it's the same in Figu, if Semyasi's supposedly walking in the room, which again, if that's happening, I want to be there, or if they are having some sort of prayer experience and some sort of mental communication, which is much more common amongst these UFO groups that religious groups have developed over time.
Well, let's see. Maybe I'll contact Michael Voigtlander again and see if he would do a podcast with me because I think he's had direct communication with these people, but I could be wrong.
Mm-hmm. Be
With these
interesting. Yeah, I'd
beings.
be interested
Sorry.
to nail him down on what direct communication means.
Would
So
you like me to connect you to him?
no, that's okay. I got too many other things going on. I don't. If they say Semyasi's showing up, I'll fly over there. But other than that,
Okay.
or maybe I won't. I don't want to spend $16,000 flying over there if they're just going to
Oh
cancel at the
no.
last minute.
No, the 16,000 was for the equipment and the
Yeah,
crew and
I know.
flights
I'm
and
just
hotels.
kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so how did we get into what is the difference between would you say what's the difference between religion and the UFO community? Is that correct to
Sure.
say the UFO community? What would you say?
I mean, I don't know how much there is a UFO community anymore because it's split up into so many groups. But I call it the UFO subculture, UFO community. I mean, I think that there's so much fracturing and
Hmm.
dislike between different groups. I don't know that they could call themselves a community, but if we're just talking about everyone who believes in UFOs, I mean, in terms of you started talking about Billy and the Aetheri Society because at times UFOs become very close to religion. They'll actually start holding what you might call services. The Aetheri Society still holds services, and I've been to them in Hollywood before. They have one of their places in Hollywood, and so it can become very close to religion. But I would say that the paranormal and UFOs in general, how they tend to operate if they don't become true religions is they tend to operate as something that people are more likely to believe in once they drift away from conventional religion. But
Interesting that you say that because you were also telling me what's happening with religion in America in recent decades. And could
it's
that
been you're right. Conventional religion, and all I'm talking about here is conventional is not a judgment on my part. All I'm talking about is that over time, the majority of Americans in the United States were Christian, smaller, and then the other groups were small minorities, and but the majority of Americans belong to a religious group of some kind or another. And over time, that number is rapidly dropping. The last numbers I saw, about 24% of Americans said that they were not religious. And that's about 10% more than that same number was 10 years previous. So that is actually the
uh,
fastest growing segment in American religion, if you want to call it that, is irreligion, that people are dropping out. And when I say they're non-religious in the various surveys, including ones that I've conducted myself, we ask people, what are you in terms of religion? Are you a Catholic? Are you a Baptist? Are you Muslim? Are you Hindu? Are you Buddhist? We'll ask them all, a whole host of religions. And then the bottom answer is, I am not, none of the above, basically. And it's that none of the above. People are saying, I'm none of these things. I'm not a Christian. I'm not a Jew. I'm not a Hindu. I'm not a Buddhist. I'm not a Muslim. I'm nothing, has been growing exponentially. But those people are not atheists. The percentage of atheists has been staying consistent for as about 4 to 5% for as far back as we have numbers. That's very consistent. So what's changing in our society is not that we have a society of people are becoming atheists. We have a society that's increasingly quickly becoming more and more disassociated with conventional religion, but open to spiritual things. And that's where the paranormal steps in. That people who tell me that they have no religion are the most likely people to believe in UFOs and ghosts and Bigfoot and other things. That they appear to be something that is more attractive. The belief in these things are more attractive to people who've drifted away from conventional religion. And part of the explanation is that some of those religions tell you not to do that stuff, right? That some of the very, very strict Orthodox and evangelical religions tell you that UFOs, ghosts, Ouija boards, all that kind of stuff is the devil's doing. Stay away from it.
Mm.
that if you get involved in that stuff, it's the devil getting hold of your soul. So sometimes these groups are just directly telling you cannot do that stuff. And so if you leave that group, you're open to it. But also, I think that what people when people are getting disaffected with conventional religion, they're leaving, but they're still wanting answers. They're still wanting the idea that there's something more than just this world because they're not becoming atheists. And that's where the paranormal is stepping in. That people who are not religious are very paranormal.
It's so interesting because I feel like it's not only they don't only run to other belief systems. Like maybe they could replace it with, a political party or, a cause, like
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, veganism,
Yep.
something. Why do you think that is? What is it about a person that needs that?
Well, I think that veganism, a political party, some will claim to, but they can't provide answers to the biggest questions. Where do we go when we die? Is there anything beyond this earth? Anything beyond what we can see? Are there people on other planets? All of these big questions are questions that can't be answered. I mean, again, some political parties will claim to be basically the mouthpiece of religion, right? Obviously, but for the most part, those earthly causes, even though they can provide a lot of meaning, are providing earthly meaning. They're not providing answers to the big existential questions. So you can see directly the appeal of something like ghosts. That if you are someone who's drifted away from conventional religion, but you can have a belief in ghosts, that is still something telling you that there is more to this world than what we can see.
Fascinating. And so does that mean, do you think that, belief in UFOs and extraterrestrials, do you think that's going to be just growing and growing and growing, or could it be replaced with something else potentially one day?
I do think it will keep growing. That again, I have people can disagree with the explanation for it, but it's just a fact and all the data that we have that these people who are non-religious are much more likely to believe in UFOs than people who are very strongly religious. So if that there's something about people drifting away from religion which opens them up to this stuff, makes them more likely to consider it. So and every indication is telling us that this percentage of nuns, this drift away from conventional religion is just going to continue to accelerate in this country. And so I'm very confident in predicting that UFO belief will be much higher than it in 20 years from now. It'll be much higher than it is now. I don't have any reason to suspect that it would drop. Now, the only thing that would change any of these things is that thing being discovered, right? If someone shoots a Bigfoot and brings them into a zoologist, then that ceases to be a paranormal thing. So that would change it. If aliens do in fact land or NASA in fact discovers an alien civilization, then that would change it. But barring barring proof that is accepted by everyone, I think this belief system will continue to grow.
Wow. Well, thanks, Chris. That was
Welcome.
so fascinating. We should do it again. I have so many more questions coming up.
Hit that like button and subscribe.